Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Alexis Gibson, and I'm the Program Manager for the Society for Ecological Restoration. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, A Climate Smart Restoration Framework, with Marion Vernon from Point Blue Conservation Science. Before we begin, since some of you might be new or joining us at our webinars for the first time, I want to give you some information about SER. We are an international organization that advances the science, policy, and practice of ecological restoration to sustain biodiversity, improve resilience in a changing climate, and reestablish an ecologically healthy relationship between nature and culture. One way we accomplish that mission is through our webinar series, like today. To browse upcoming events and get information on our many other resources, we invite you to look at our website, www.ser.org. To that end, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for future review in our webinar library after around a day or two. A few details about today's event. The session will run for around an hour with time for questions at the end. You are all muted, but you can type your questions into the questions box, and the speaker will address specific questions from you towards the end of the session. So now I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, Marion Vernon. Marion is the Sierra Meadow Adaptation Leader at Point Blue Conservation Science, where she works with partners to catalyze climate-smart meadow restoration and land conservation in the Sierra Nevada. Her background is in the conservation, policy, management, and governance of public and private lands with wildlife in the Western U.S. She received her Master's of Environmental Science degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies in 2015. And now I'll turn it over to you, Marion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to Alexis and SER for having me. So in this presentation today, I am going to introduce you all to Point Blue's Climate Smart Restoration Framework and provide examples of how it can be used to inform restoration projects. And as Alexis said, right now I'm working on restoration and protection of wet montane meadows in California's Sierra Nevada range, with a specific focus on climate change adaptation. So when I approach the restoration projects that I work on with our partners, I do so through this lens of climate change adaptation. So the framework I'll be presenting today was developed by Point Blue in order to translate ecological theory into on-the-ground practice and to translate science in a way that is applicable to restoration practitioners and land managers. And we have trained a wide range of restoration practitioners and land managers in this approach through workshops, webinars such as this, and by contributing as members and leaders of restoration projects. We have employed this framework with great success across a range of riparian, wetland, and wet meadow restoration projects throughout California. And throughout this presentation, I'll be providing background on the principles that make up the framework and their ecological basis. And I'll provide some examples of how we have used this framework and the principles to inform ecological restoration projects. And though my examples today come from our experience applying this framework in wetland and riparian systems in California, this framework and its principles are really broad enough to be applied in any ecosystem or geography. And so before I get into the content of my presentation, I asked Alexis to put together two polls for me. I just wanted to get a better sense of who is in the audience today. So Alexis, if you could pull those up, that'd be great.
The first poll is up. I'm just going to give people a few seconds to vote. So I will be closing the first poll. And that should pull up that.
I'm not able to see the results on my screen, so maybe you could just share those out.
It looks like we have 15% researchers. So the question was, which of the following best describes your position? 15% researchers, 41% restoration practitioner, 12% land manager, 12% student, and 21% other. And then
Great.
I can just get this next one up. Here we go. I'm going to be launching the next poll on which of the following best describes your professional affiliation. So we'll give people a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to close this poll now and share. Oh, it disappeared. So in this case, it was which of the following best describes your professional affiliation? And we had 23% nonprofit, 37% government agency, 20% academic, 18% private industry, and 2% tribal.
Great. Looks like we've got a really diverse group today, which is excellent. So hopefully there'll be a little bit of something for everyone in today's presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end if I'm not covering things that people want to hear. Okay, so to get started here, advance to the next slide. So I wanted to start by providing some background on my organization, Point Blue. So Point Blue Conservation Science was originally founded in 1965 as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory in Marin County, California, which is just north of San Francisco. And our mission is to conserve birds, other wildlife, and their ecosystems through science, partnerships, and outreach. And we work to reduce the impacts of environmental change and promote nature-based solutions for wildlife and people. A lot of our projects take place in California, but we do work internationally, most notably in Antarctica. And everything that we do through the lens of climate change. So our current strategic goal is to increase the pace and scale of climate-smart conservation and restoration. And that means giving webinars like this today to help train and inform partners and the conservation community at large about our climate-smart approach. And so the people that work at Point Blue, we are a science organization, so a lot of our work has to do with doing our own research, partnering with others, and translating our science to inform conservation, management, and restoration. So to give some framing here, why is it important for us to consider climate change and restoration? So restoration has often been based on historic baselines or present-day reference systems. But there is increasing recognition that climate change requires us to rethink the reference systems we're using, given that future conditions will be different from past and even present state conditions. And so in order for us to be developing restoration projects that will have not only short-term benefits, but long-term benefits, we really need to be considering climate change when we're planning projects and implementing projects. And so this concept is reflected in the recently updated SER standards and practices, which emphasizes that environmental change should be taken into account when selecting an appropriate reference system. And I like this definition in the standards and practices because obviously understanding historic baselines and looking at reference systems from the past and also the present are still really important. And at the same time, we also need to think about how climate change might impact the ecosystem state in the future and update and maybe consider how that might impact our expectations for what desired site conditions might look like. So we really need to consider and address climate change in our restoration projects to avoid restoring a system that may not be able to adapt or persist in the face of future climate. So at Point Blue, we define this concept of climate-smart ecological restoration as the process of enhancing the ecological function of degraded or destroyed areas in a manner that prepares them for the consequences of climate change. And so one of the challenges that comes with designing projects with climate change in mind is that there is uncertainty inherent in climate projections. And so this is something that I hear from partners on occasion, is that they don't really want to consider or think about climate change because it just seems too uncertain, and it's really difficult for people to figure out how to deal with that uncertainty. And so it oftentimes becomes something that's overlooked entirely. So on the one hand, we can't assume that the ecosystem state of the past will persist into the future. And on the other hand, there are multiple possible future ecosystem states depending on how the climate might change. So for example, in California where I work, climate models disagree about whether or not California might see increases or decreases in our annual precipitation. And obviously this has huge implications for uncertainty around water supply for human communities, and also water available for species and ecosystems. So rather than choose one scenario over the other, so say design a project only assuming that there might be increases in precipitation, we can respond to this uncertainty by designing projects that can succeed under multiple scenarios. So considering the range of possible futures can also help us make better decisions about where to prioritize restoration efforts. And indeed, prioritizing and planning restoration based on current conditions alone might not result in the most optimal of outcomes. So to give an example of how we can cope with uncertainty, this figure is by a paper led by Point Blue from Bellows et al. 2013. And in this paper, we projected the future distribution and abundance of 5 tidal marsh bird species through the end of the 21st century in response to changes in habitat availability and suitability under different climate scenarios. So the goal of this exercise was to think through how prioritization of sites for restoration might change depending on different future scenarios. So the project team looked at different models of projected sea level rise, salinity, and sediment availability in the San Francisco Bay estuary to inform restoration planning to benefit the tidal marsh bird species that we care about. So this figure shows the results of that modeling exercise about which areas of the landscape should be prioritized for restoration under different scenarios. So the darker colors represent areas that are higher priority for restoration to benefit tidal marsh bird species. So in this figure in the upper left corner, figure A, this shows the results of the modeling exercises under looking only at present day conditions. And then figures B and C here look at different scenarios of salinity, sea level rise, and sediment. So these are 2 different possible scenarios about how climate change might impact this landscape. And then finally, in the bottom right corner, figure D, is a combined model, which looks at both of the models combined. And so the models here suggest that only using current conditions to prioritize areas for restoration would actually result in the poorest performing restoration projects to benefit tidal marsh birds. The most robust method for selecting restoration projects came from using figure D here, this combined model, which used projections from all the future scenarios while discounting areas with high levels of variability among possible futures. So this really illustrates that considering uncertainty can actually help us make better decisions and hopefully result in more effective restoration projects. So to assist practitioners in identifying climate-smart actions for their projects, Point Blue developed these 7 climate-smart restoration principles. And so these principles are based on ecological theory as recommended for watershed restoration by Palmer 2009, and also the climate-smart tenets and principles developed by Hansen et al. 2009 and Glick et al. 2011. And so at Point Blue, we lead climate-smart restoration workshops with restoration practitioners, land managers, scientists, and others that introduce them to these principles and help translate the ecological theory into on-the-ground practice in the context of specific projects. And so for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to walk through each of these 7 principles and discuss their theoretical basis and provide some examples of how they've been applied in Point Blue's work. So the first principle is to show your work. So this means when you are beginning planning for your project, it means that you're recording your assumptions about how the climate might change and how it might impact your project goals and objectives. So it really means describing how you made decisions in light of climate change. And so as we just discussed, there is uncertainty around climate projections. So showing your work is really essential so that you're capturing your assumptions about the climate projections you were considering for a given project site that you use to make decisions. So for example, we lead these workshops with practitioners for specific projects. And the way we run these workshops is that we identify the range of climate projections for their project area, and then as a team, we discuss how those projections might impact their ability to achieve their project goals, and help them brainstorm appropriate restoration and management actions that can help reduce potential climate vulnerabilities and increase the resilience of their project site. And we record the results of these workshops in what we call climate-smart technical briefs. And so these briefs are really useful because it provides a guide, a record to guide future actions. And it can also be useful to consult, a decade or so down the road and actually look at how your site is coping with climate change and look at potential impacts. And then you can consult this brief that you've come up with and see if the climate is kind of changing and having the impacts that you expected and planned for. The next principle is to look forward, but don't ignore the past. So as I was describing previously, the past might not necessarily be the best guide to a future functioning ecosystem state. But at the same time, it is useful to consider past conditions, especially about how species and ecosystems might have responded to past climate change to inform current planning efforts. So this could be looking at how areas of the landscape might have been climate refugia during periods of past change and prioritizing projects within those refugial areas that might not experience the same magnitude of climate change as other areas in the landscape. And you could also consider how species might have shifted their ranges in response to past climate change and use that information to prioritize and think through connectivity across the landscape. Another way to think about this, for example, I was leading a climate-smart workshop for a project last week for a wet meadow system in the Sierra Nevada of California. And one of our partners said that the system that we were looking at had a few fens located in the wet meadow. And he noted that these fens accumulated peat over the past 1,000 or so years. And during that period of time, there have been really significant drought periods, but these fens still persist today. So his takeaway was that these fens have been really stable even in response to climatic during past drought periods. And so his takeaway was that these fins may serve as future refugia for the project area. At the same time, we also want to look forward and use climate projections to assess possible changes and vulnerabilities to project goals. So for example, this image here is of the watersheds of the Sierra Valley of California, which is again located in the Sierra Nevada range. And it's a really vast landscape full of freshwater wetlands and wet meadows. And so we worked with the local land trust to identify how groundwater recharge and surface water runoff might change in these watersheds by mid-century. So this map shows the proportion of expected recharge and runoff available in each watershed by mid-century compared to present-day baseline conditions. So this exercise helped highlight some watersheds and wetlands that might be more vulnerable to changing hydrology than others, while others might be more refugial and have less expected change in their water availability. So analyses like these can help prioritize certain sites for restoration and help identify potential vulnerabilities that can be addressed to restoration projects. The next principle is to consider the broader context. So we know that climate change is going to act in concert with other stressors and may even create new stressors to the systems that we care about. So for example, your restoration site conditions might change and be more susceptible to invasive species. You might also experience new anthropogenic pressures and stressors that might increase in response to climate change. So in California, for instance, there might be increased pressure for water diversion, increased pressure for expansion of agriculture, or even development pressure in new areas in response to things like wildfire risk or extreme heat events that might shift where people are developing and building homes across the landscape. So this really means that practitioners should consider the broader context of their projects and how these other stressors might be addressed in concert with climate change. And this also means considering the landscape context in terms of how it might confer adaptation benefits and increase adaptive capacity. So for example, in research led by Point Blue, Gardali and Holmes' 2011 article found that riparian restoration success, as measured by riparian bird response, was enhanced by selecting sites for restoration near remnant riparian habitat. And this study was looking at riparian habitat in the Central Valley of California. And so their results suggest that planning restoration projects near existing high-quality habitat can help meet project goals while also leading to some climate benefits by decreasing potential fragmentation and also increasing connectivity and allowing for gene flow and for species to have some room to migrate across the landscape in response to climate change. So this principle, again, is about identifying stressors and also thinking about how the landscape context of where your project is located might help confer some adaptive capacity. The next principle is to build ecological insurance or redundancy into your projects. So to give an example of what we mean from redundancy in terms of human engineering projects, engineers often incorporate redundancies into the structures or machines that they're building. So for example, airplanes have multiple engines and bridges are over-engineered, which is to ensure that if one part of that bridge fails or if one of the engines on the plane fails, the plane or the bridge is still going to function. So in restoration, this means that we want to ensure that redundancies are in place so that if climate change hits one part of the system really hard, the system is still able to function. So we refer to this as functional redundancy. And so that could mean introducing species or genotypes to your site that replicate critical functions that may be better adapted to future conditions. I strongly recommend looking at this article by Dinwiddie et al. From 2009, which describes this idea of redundancy in detail. So to just give a few examples of what this looks like in practice, one way that we build ecological insurance into the design of restoration projects that we lead is through our climate smart planting palette tools. So we have developed these planting palette tools to help increase the adaptive capacity of ecological communities through revegetation efforts as part of ecological restoration. And so we've developed right now, we have planting palette tools for Sierra Meadows, which I just recently completed. We also have planting palettes for coastal riparian areas in California, and also the tidal marsh upland transition zone in the San Francisco Bay estuary. And so the way that we designed these palettes is that we included a really comprehensive list of locally occurring species that could be used in restoration projects for the given ecosystem. So in my case, Sierra Meadows. And so for each of the species included in the tool, we evaluate their different traits that are relevant to building resiliency to climate change. So for example, some of the traits we look at include climatic tolerances, such as wet-tolerant species or drought-tolerant species. We also look at adaptations to potential climate-accelerated disturbances. So that could be adaptations to wildfires or floods. And we also consider species that provide resources for wildlife, such as fruit, flowers, seeds, or cover. And the goal here is to use the planting palette tool to build a diverse planting palette for a given restoration site with multiple species representing each trait value, which therefore builds in this idea of redundancy. So there's not just one species that is, for example, providing resources for wildlife. You have multiple species providing resources for wildlife, so that in case one of those species becomes stressed or even locally extirpated from the site, you have other species at the site that are still able to provide that function in that community. So for example, this figure on the right side of the screen provides a comparison of how a climate smart revegetation design might differ from a traditional restoration design. So it essentially has to do with increasing greatly the number of species that represent these different trait values that we care about, that we think are going to be important to confer some adaptive capacity to the restoration site. So again, this has to do with increasing diversity and increasing functional redundancy so that you have multiple species on a site providing the same function, so that if one species gets hit hard by climate change, you don't lose that species' function because it is replicated by other species at the site. So another element to consider when thinking about planting designs and revegetation is the potential for phenological mismatches. So a mismatch occurs when a species or an ecological phase is not concurrent in time with its interacting partner. So for example, this could be, the classic example is insects that are emerging earlier in the year, but birds that are migrating back to their breeding grounds are out of phase with the timing of insect emergence. So birds are not arriving at these sites at the same time that the insects are available. So peak insect abundance is shifting to earlier in the year, but birds might not necessarily be tracking that change in terms of when they're migrating to the site. So if you do a literature search, there have been multiple studies investigating and hypothesizing about phenological mismatches, both in terms of mutualistic species and relationships, such as plants and their pollinators, and also predatory relationships, such as the example I just gave with insects and the birds that consume them. So at Point Blue, we wanted to figure out how we could actually try to address such mismatches in restoration. So the figure on the left side of the page here is from a recent paper that Point Blue was involved with that examined potential ways to address phenological mismatches between a plant and an animal mutualist. So the dark blue curve in the figure here represents the animal mutualist, such as a pollinator, and the light blue curve represents the plant resource. So under climate change, so right now, these two curves might be overlapping. So we have the timing of the plant emerging coinciding with the timing of this pollinator being active. But under climate change, the pollinator might shift its activity to earlier in the year, resulting in this, this light green coloring here, which represents this mismatch of when the pollinator is active and when the flower is actually, or the plant is actually blooming. And so there's a mismatch here in the timing. So one way that this paper proposed that you could manage this mismatch is by adding in a supplementary resource partner. So our planting palette tools strove to integrate this idea of supplemental resource partners by including resource phenology for each species in our planting palette tools. So resource phenology specifically, we were looking at when species were flowering and producing fruit and producing seed, which are all important resources for birds and other wildlife. And so we mapped out their phenology for each month about when these species were providing resources. So again, this is a comparison of a traditional restoration design with a more climate smart design. And the idea here is to have multiple species providing these resources each month to benefit wildlife and reduce potential mismatches. So the restoration design in this figure here aims to diversify the planting palette with multiple different species that provide resources during different times of the growing season. So in coastal California, we have a year-long growing season, and in this climate smart design, you might be including species in your palette that are blooming early in the year. So that ensures that your site has these resources available and can help manage any potential mismatches between, say, pollinators and having fruit or flowers available for them. The next principle has to do with building in evolutionary resilience. So this means taking advantage of the inherent genetic variability and diversity within and among species to facilitate adaptation. So obviously one of the great strengths that we have in terms of climate change adaptation is having really large populations with a lot of genetic variability, because in that case, there could be some inherent genetic adaptations within a species or a population that could confer some climate resiliency. So there are a few different ways that you can build evolutionary resilience into your projects, and I'll highlight a few examples here. So one way to do this could be to look at how individuals of a target species respond during extreme events and source propagules or seeds from those individuals for use in your project. So for example, this is a photo of the Van Norden Meadow Restoration Project located near Lake Tahoe, California. And this photo was taken during the height of California's last drought. So you can see in the foreground here that these willows in the foreground are brown and defoliated as a result of this drought period. But the willow in the back here still remains green, even during this really extreme drought. So a few things could be going on here. That green willow might be fortunate enough to have found a pocket of groundwater, or it could have genes that make it better adapted to drought conditions. So you could mark that willow and harvest sprigs from it for revegetation at your project site, as it might be better adapted to drier future conditions. So at this meadow, we could harvest some sprigs from this willow and plant throughout the site to increase that genotype within the meadow, which potentially could confer some resilience to this project site. Another way to build an evolutionary resilience is by sourcing individuals for your restoration site from areas of your local watershed or even the broader landscape that have similar expected future conditions, such as areas across the landscape that are warmer or drier. So one example of this is this idea of climate-adjusted provenancing. This figure on the left side is from Provenancing et al. 2015. And so this idea of climate-adjusted provenancing involves sourcing seeds towards the direction of predicted climate change by including a mix of local genotypes, which is in the starred circle here, along with genetic material that has evolved in environments more similar to the projected features of the restoration site. So in this case, in this figure here, it's showing a climate gradient of increasing aridity. So you could be sourcing seeds from this species across this gradient of aridity. So essentially, this means biasing seed sourcing towards the direction of predicted climate change. Another way that you might do this, which is something that we often do in our projects, is looking within the immediate watershed of the project site and thinking about areas of that watershed that might already be a little bit warmer and drier, for example, and sourcing propagules or seeds from that area of the watershed that's warmer and drier and bringing it to your restoration site to help potentially include some new genetic variability here that might increase the adaptive capacity of your site. And obviously there's some risk involved in this strategy, and so it's really important to do an assessment of risk and see if it makes sense to incorporate these types of strategies into your project. And that's really up to the restoration practitioner and your particular site and species that you're looking at. So this is our penultimate principle, which is to include the human community in your project. So obviously climate change is a really big issue and people may feel like they can't do anything about it. So involving people in a restoration project can empower them to do something real and tangible to address climate change and help educate them about climate change as well. Including the human community also opens doors to incorporating local and traditional knowledge. And practitioners might not even realize that they were missing this type of knowledge until they include a broader representative community in their project. So a few examples of how we do this at Point Blue. One way is that when we lead these restoration workshops, we really aim to invite a wide range of stakeholders to participate in order to ensure that we have lots of different perspectives in the room, both interdisciplinary perspectives and also different types of knowledge. And so, in a typical workshop for us, we might have restoration practitioners, scientists, experts for specific species. We'll invite funding agencies, permitting agencies, land managers, etc. And so this has really been valuable for us to help identify new considerations for these projects that we might have missed if we had a smaller group of people involved. Another way that we include the human community is through Point Blue's STRAW program, which stands for Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. And this program engages students in restoration efforts, such as assisting in revegetation. And so the images on the screen here are from two of our STRAW projects. The one on the left is from a riparian restoration, I believe, most likely in Marin or Sonoma County. And the figure on the right is from Child's Meadow, which is a meadow I'll be talking about in just a few slides, where we had students come out and plant willows for us. And honestly, these students do a better job of planting willows than trained adults. The survival rate is a lot higher, actually. So it is really useful for us as restoration practitioners and also valuable for the students as well to have these types of experiences. All right, our last principle here is incorporating research and monitoring into your projects. So climate change, as I've said many times today, is inherently uncertain. And so at the same time, the response of our sites to restoration interventions can also be uncertain. So we really recommend that practitioners develop a monitoring and adaptive management plan to evaluate whether restoration was effective and also to see how the site is responding to climate change. And so the results of monitoring can also be used to inform how you manage that site post-restoration, especially as climate impacts might become more apparent. Restoration experiments are also really important to help answer uncertainties, evaluate effectiveness, and to inform project design. So for this last slide here, I wanted to give an example of how we incorporate monitoring and experimentation into this particular project. So this is the Child's Meadow Restoration Project, which is a project that I am actively involved with and Plant Glue is currently leading. And so this project site is located in Northern California, just south of Lassen Volcanic National Park, if you're familiar with that geography. It's a really large wet meadow system. And so we've been integrating a lot of experimentation and monitoring into this restoration site. So a few years ago, the project team got together and developed and implemented a modified before-after control impact study to test the impacts of 2 different restoration treatments on carbon sequestration, hydrology, and sensitive species. So we substituted space for time in this study. And so we had a negative control on the site where cattle grazing was allowed to continue. And we also had a positive control reach at the bottom of the screen in blue, which had some of the desired conditions that we wanted to see for the rest of the meadow. So in addition to these negative and positive control reaches, we had 2 treatment reaches, which are in the middle of the screen here. So this reach here had a riparian fence to exclude livestock grazing, and we also used some beaver dam analogs as a restoration treatment along the riparian channel of this wet meadow. And our other treatment up here was grazing exclusion alone. And so the results of this study, we found that this treatment with the beaver dam analogs had really promising results. We had beaver ponds from the beaver dam analogs that had increased and sustained high groundwater levels, and it seemed that willow survival and our focal species all had some. And so we are using the results from this experiment to inform restoration planning to scale up restoration across this entire meadow system, which is quite large. And so we are currently doing restoration planning for the entire meadow complex, and we're going to experiment with scaling up the use of these beaver dam analogs and other restoration treatments across the entire meadow. And we're integrating monitoring and experimentation throughout the project lifecycle as well. And this image on this last slide here is an image of Child's Meadow looking towards Lassen Volcanic National Park with, you can see the nice water spreading out across the floodplain from behind the beaver dam analog. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar and thank SER for hosting and having me. And I'm happy to answer questions now. I've also included my email address here in case you'd like to follow up with me directly after this webinar. And I also encourage you to check out Plant Glue's website for more climate smart restoration resources. We have a climate smart restoration handbook specific to Sierra wet meadows that also I think could be applicable to other areas as well. And you can also find these climate smart planting palette tools that I mentioned earlier are also available for download at our site, along with many other different resources that I encourage you to check out.
Great, thank you, Marian. And we already have quite a few questions in the questions box. So if you have a question now or one comes to mind As we answer some of these, please feel free to type them in. We had a few questions about what a beaver dam analog is. So could you give some
Yes.
description of that?
Yes, definitely. So a beaver dam analog is basically a human-made structure that mimics what a beaver dam would do. So it usually involves doing a lot of staking of wood posts into across a stream, and then weaving in willow branches and mud and other debris to kind of plug in that dam. And then we plant willows usually across the top of it. And so it acts as a dam that blocks and slows the spread of water. And this is really useful in systems that are incised. So in our meadow systems, usually they have degraded hydrology that we're trying to restore. And so these beaver dam analogs can help serve as a dam that slows out how fast water is moving through the system and ideally spreads the water onto the floodplain to help reactivate the groundwater table. So we're trying to do the work of beavers. And at this particular site, Child's Meadow, there is an active beaver population. And so we're kind of building these beaver dam analogs as kind of starter homes for the local beavers with the hope that they will take over the maintenance of these structures for us.
Great. Next, do you have recommendations for online databases or other sources for finding the species and functional trait information you were talking about, including in your species tools, species picker tools?
Yeah. So on Point Blue's website, you can download, I think we have 4 or so of these climate smart planting palette tools. And so we have the tool database, which is like an Excel file, and we have these user guides. And it's really easy to just look at one of those user guides, and you can get a lot of information and ideas about the traits that we included and the types of, and where we've gathered that information as well. So I'd recommend looking at those user guides, and I think it would be pretty easy to replicate it using kind of the methods that are described in that user guide. And in terms of like other databases, I relied heavily on the USDA plants database, which I think covers North America only, and the Fire Effects Information System, which again is North American focused. Both of those had really good information on species profiles and different trait values that I used to inform both which traits I was including in the tool that I developed, as well as for getting information about specific species.
Great. Next question is, what do you think about assisted migration in the context of climate smart restoration, especially phenotypic mismatch and/or evolutionary resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there is a place for assisted migration, and it has to be done very carefully and with an assessment of risk. And so there's been some really good research out. I'm forgetting the name of the author, but there have been some studies looking at assisted migration of cottonwood in the American Southwest. And they've done some like common garden experiments looking at how successful translocation of these different cottonwoods would be. And one of their main takeaways was that you need to use a phased approach. So you can't just bring species, or individuals rather, to a restoration site from a really far distance. It usually takes kind of a multi-phased approach with only moving individuals, a certain distance, and then allowing them to adapt to that local climate before moving them again. So I think there is a place for it, and it just needs to be considered more carefully. And usually when I think about assisted migration in terms of our projects, I'm thinking about moving individuals within a species range. So I'm not really talking about taking a species out of its current range and moving it to an entirely different system outside of its range, maybe looking at range edges. But I'm usually thinking about within a species range, taking advantage of the diversity within that population.
Great. All right, we have time for a few more questions. So from the more practical side, do the extra number of plant species used in these types of projects cause budgetary concerns for clients or project managers?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I haven't implemented myself these planting palette projects yet. I just developed one for Sierra Meadows, but that is something that we are considering. And one of the limitations, in addition to potentially budget issues, is where we're sourcing material and looking at nurseries locally to see if they have these species that we're interested in using, or if they're willing to grow them for us. So one of the things that I did when I was developing my planting palette tool for Sierra Meadows was I looked at existing nursery stock to see which species are currently available for inclusion into the palette. So I think that should be obviously a consideration when designing the palette and thinking about which species to include.
Sorry, I was on mute. So another question was, if you have a set amount of resources, this is related to the question you just answered, are you putting more species into smaller areas or trying to spread out all of the species across the same area you would have restored before? Is there a preference?
Yeah, that's another great question. So it would depend. Like at this meadow system that you're seeing on the screen, we did some willow plantings, and we kind of experimented with doing like really dense clumps of willows at some parts, and then staggering that with less dense areas of willows, just to kind of see how that impacts the response. Because there are trade-offs with either approach. If you pack species in really densely, that actually is a form of redundancy, component redundancy, that might confer some stability. But at the same time, if you're working in a really large landscape and you want to take advantage of potentially different microclimates or topographic variability, you might want to actually spread those species out. So I think it would depend on the context of your site, and there are trade-offs in either scenario.
Thank you. One question is, why do you think willows planted by children have a higher survival rate than those planted by adults?
That should be a whole research study. I think in our case, we have really good plant protocol checks. So once the students plant the willow or whatever, they do a plant check, and we come out and we take a look and we see and make sure it's really stable in the ground. And I think maybe sometimes when we're hiring, a consulting firm to go do that work, sometimes the quality control isn't as good. So I don't know, maybe children are just, better and more natural at planting willows, but they're really enthusiastic about it and they want to do a good job, which leads to better quality, I think.
Okay. So we have another question comment. This one says, as a paleo PhD candidate, I really appreciate the inclusion of principle number 2. How far back do you recommend we look in the past? Are paleoecological data sets used to understand past change for restoration?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I can't give you like if it's 1,000 years or 100,000 years, but I think it is really useful to consider going back pretty far, especially when it comes to like thinking through how species have shifted their ranges. So like in the Sierra Nevada, our forests have been constantly shifting in elevation over past changes in climate. So I think it provides a useful perspective that like species range shifts are something that happens naturally. It's a natural process, and we can help facilitate those range shifts by thinking about how species might have responded in the past. And I also think it's useful when thinking about these refugial areas of the landscape that might not have experienced as much change. And so one study that I'm familiar with looked at just within the past 100 years, areas of the landscape in the Sierra Nevada that hadn't really experienced much change in terms of temperature and precipitation. And so even like within a smaller period of 100 years, you can see some refugial characteristics on the landscape.
Great. And I think we have time for one last question. Can you speak more to how traditional ecological knowledge is being incorporated into these projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one example that comes to mind immediately is, so when I was developing this Sierra Meadow planting palette tool, I actually included cultural ethnobotanical characteristics for those species. So I was looking at plants that, were used by Native people in terms of providing, a specific function. So like willows used for basket weaving. I looked at plants that were medicinal or ceremonial or providing food resources. So we really wanted to incorporate that into this latest planting palette tool that we developed by considering these ethnobotanical species. And another way is just, making sure that you have those individuals on your project teams or in your workshops. And that can provide some, going back to principle 2 about considering the past, that can provide some context about what the system might have looked like before it was degraded as well, and provide some information to help inform your understanding of the baseline condition.
Okay. Thank you, Marion, for that wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of our webinar participants. Marion's contact information is there, since I know we weren't able to get to many of your questions. I hope you can follow up with her. You'll also be getting a follow-up email from SER with a certificate of completion if you need one, as well as a survey to give us feedback on today's event. I encourage you to visit the Society for Ecological Restoration website to learn more about our work and the benefits of membership with the Society, including access to our entire webinar and conference library. Today's webinar was recorded. Within the next day or two, it will be up on our website if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with anyone. Please be safe and be healthy, and we hope you'll all be able to join us again next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.